everyone. Thank you so much for joining us live today and for reviewing this recording on demand afterwards, if that's what you're doing. I do really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to come and see this webinar. Oh, there we go. So, after analyzing more than 12,000 requirements from various sectors, we've gained some fresh insights into what might hamper project success. And from this analysis, we're really excited to introduce ReqInsights, a three-part webinar series, starting with today's presentation, Mastering Requirements, a deep dive into automation and accuracy, part 1. But first, as you saw a little preview there, a little bit about us. We are QRA Corp, and we are based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, which you can see in a nice big aerial view of our downtown and our harbor in the background of this slide here. And our product, QVScribe, is used across various industries like oil and gas, automotive, and medical services to help teams write requirements that are clearer and more consistent in a lot less time. And we do this by providing a quality analysis for the individual requirements and then feedback on overall consistency of language and units, and then similarity of language across the document. Now a little bit more about myself. So my name is Morgan Costel, and I'm your presenter for today. I'm a customer success manager here at QRA, and I've been a QRexian for just over 8 months now, and I'm super excited to be presenting my first solo webinar to you folks. I have prior experience working in technical sales and support for customers in neurotechnology and security industries, and I've also worked with research device vendors, all of which really gives me a unique perspective when it comes to requirements writing. My role at QRA more specifically is to support the success of teams and users who are incorporating QVScribe into their requirements workflows. I'm also one of the customer success team members who helps provide training sessions for our product and information sessions around what makes a good requirement. Now, who are you? You are likely requirements leaders and authors eager to learn a bit more about our ReqInsights project and how you might be able to apply our findings to your everyday and to your teams. Whether you're a technical manager, systems engineer, requirements engineer, a business analyst, or just someone who really loves requirements, I hope you find something useful and informative from our three-part webinar series. Some of the topics that we will cover throughout this three-part series include common characteristics of good requirements and an introduction to QVScribe's problem types and why they are important. We will also talk about the collective results of our ReqInsights project, as well as industry-specific trends for various measurements, which will be outlined and justified in today's presentation. And then finally, we will showcase how our tool QVScribe can be used to identify potential problems within your requirements and then help remediate them. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is this ReqInsights project I keep hearing about? Well, our team analyzed over 50 documents, nearly 13,000 requirements across various industries like oil and gas, shipbuilding, defense, and space, and tried to see if there were any emerging trends or, well, insights that we can gather from this data. This initial part of the webinar series will focus a bit more on the methodology, primarily, that was used for the ReqInsights project, but we will also feature some of the initial findings. So we used our tool QVScribe to run the following 3 analyses on the requirements: quality analysis, similarity analysis, and an ears conformance check. We also identified the top 5 problem types for each document. We will dive into what problem types mean and why this was chosen a little bit later in today's presentation. Then, we also segmented all of these results by the following industries, like that oil and gas, automotive, software development, to see if there were any industry-specific trends when it comes to the quality analysis score distribution, the top 3 problem types, ears conformance, and the similarity analysis. Now, as requirements authors and aficionados, you likely understand the importance of well-written requirements and the impact of poor requirements. But first, before we dive into the methodology, I want to take some time to address why did we even start the ReqInsights project? I think that this quote illustrates exactly why quite concisely and clearly. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. There was a Pulse of the Professional report that came out a few years ago on requirements management specifically, and they found that the primary cause of project delays and rework were requirements issues. In fact, nearly 10% of project cost increases are due to poor requirements, and nearly 50% of unsuccessful projects fail to meet their goals due to poor requirements. And more than half of all engineering errors originate in the requirements. So if you can catch those problems within the requirements while they're in the requirement stage of the project, you can save yourself a lot of time and money and headaches. So if the first thing you take away from this webinar is that it is really good practice to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Trademarked. Not really. And that's because poorly written requirements can be very expensive and have wide-reaching problems. So delays in your procurement can cause cost increases. You may also end up buying the wrong thing. Sometimes suppliers end up with some inflated pricing because of this, and also undiscovered risk. And then there's always the wasted time that's spent working on everything. I think that the impact of bad requirements are quite clear, but the question is then, what makes a good requirement? And that's really a loaded question because your team, your organization, your industry, you might have specific rules or guidelines that designate a good requirement. However, based on our knowledge of our clientele and our research, we have determined some 4 common good characteristics of a requirement. These may be similar to those that you have in your organization. There may be overlap with other characteristics that you have identified, but I think we can all agree that a requirement should be complete, verifiable, unitary, and clear. Now, when I talk about a complete requirement, I mean that a complete requirement is fully stated in one place, has no missing information, and requires no further explanation. A verifiable requirement means that the implementation of the requirement can be determined through one of 4 possible inspection methods: inspection, demonstration, testing, or analysis. A unitary requirement means that a requirement addresses one and only one thing. Negative and compound statements are discouraged. And finally, a clear requirement is subject to one and only one interpretation. It is concisely stated without recourse or technical jargon. The acceptance criteria through whichever verification method we chose is clear, and any acronyms used are defined elsewhere within the requirements document. Now that we've gone over the impact of bad requirements and the common characteristics of good requirements that are likely relevant across all industries, we have a baseline for the ReqInsights project and why our team undertook this analysis. But now that we have answered the why, we can start addressing the how. How can you determine whether a large number of requirements follow these characteristics, or even utilize best practices and techniques to ensure that future requirements are considered good? Well, that's where QBScribe can come in. We can actually map each of these characteristics to QBScribe quality analysis problem types. As a reminder, one of the ways that QBScribe was used in the ReqInsights project was to determine whether there were any trends with problem types, both with the collective data and the industry-specific data. Through these problem types and common characteristics, we can better understand how authors are writing their requirements, things we might want to keep an eye out for, and industry-specific nuances. So no imperatives, open-ended clauses, passive voice, and incomplete sentences fall under the complete characteristic. Non-specific temporal words, immeasurable quantification, optional escape clauses, and superfluous infinitives fall under verifiable. Multiple imperatives, negative imperatives, excessive continuances, justification, those all fall under the unitary characteristic. And then finally, vague words, cross-referencing pronouns, and universal quantifiers fall under that clear characteristic. Now we'll take a bit of time to dive deeper into these characteristics, best practices for writing requirements with these characteristics, and how the QBScribe problem types can help authors potentially automate these processes. So first, we'll start with the characteristic of a complete requirement. I've included a description of each problem types over here on the left of the screen, just in case you're not familiar with them. Over on the right here, you can see that the best practice for a complete requirement are that they have exactly one imperative, do not use open-ended clauses, they should be written in active voice and avoid passive voice, and then incomplete sentences should be avoided. If you do ever find that your requirement is not complete in its current state, here are a couple of remediation techniques that you could use. You can ensure that there is just a single imperative present in your requirement. Replace the open-ended clause with the information that it's being alluded to. And ensure that the object, action, and subject are clearly defined within the requirement. Next, we have the best practices for verifiable requirements. And they are that they do not use non-specific timing references, nor immeasurable quantification, nor optional words or phrases, and they avoid superfluous infinitives. Some remediation techniques for this would be to replace any non-specific temporal words with very specific timing constraints, to replace any immeasurable quantifications with a quantity that can be objectively measured, to replace any optional escape clauses with a verifiable statement and mark as required or optional as it is intended, and then to remove any superfluous infinitives or verbs that could cause potential verification issues. The best practices for unitary requirements are that they have exactly one imperative. Do not use negative imperatives as they can be very difficult to verify. Avoid the excessive use of continuances, generally no more than 2. And avoid putting any justification within the requirement itself. If you do find that you have something that is non-unitary in its current state, some of the things that you could do is split a requirement with more than one imperative into multiple requirements with just that one imperative. Restate the requirements with negative imperatives as one or more requirements with the positive imperative. You should really be specifying what the system shall do and not what it shall not do. Can also restate the requirements with excessive continuances as multiple requirements, each with a much more simpler specification. And then finally, remove any information regarding purpose or justification from the requirement. Maybe add this information instead to the rationale statement or create a new rationale instead. Finally, we have the best practices for clear requirements. And that is that they don't use vague words or phrases or pronouns or cross-referencing pronouns, and that you use universal quantifiers very sparingly and carefully. If you do find that that happens and you want to try to fix it so that the requirement is much clearer, some of the things you can do is restate the requirement so that the vague words have much more clear and definite intent. Instead of having pronouns or cross-referencing pronouns, be sure to use nouns and repeat them in full instead, and try not to refer to other things and other requirements. Be very explicit about who or what is doing an action. And then unless it's clear by context, try to restate the requirement with very specific values for any quantities measured instead of having those very open and blurry universal quantifiers. Not only did we take a look at all of these common problem types within the documents for the ReqInsights project, we also recorded the average quality analysis score for each document. So QVScribe looks at the individual requirement and assigns it a score of 1 to 5 to determine the requirement quality, with 1 being very high risk of being misinterpreted by whoever is reviewing or taking a look at their requirement, trying to test it, and 5 being very low risk of being misinterpreted. And a combination of factors go into this scoring, but each of the problem types that we just reviewed do have different weightings associated with them. For example, something like no imperatives would be considered very high risk at being misinterpreted because it's just not clear, is this a requirement? Whereas something like superfluous infinitives is much more medium risk. Finally, we also have a couple of these problem types that don't actually impact this score because they depend much more on the context of the requirement and have the potential for risk. So that's a quality warning you see here. And this includes justification, universal quantifiers, passive voice, and incomplete sentences. So here is a quick example of one of the requirements that was analyzed for the ReqInsights project. You can see that there is the quality score, the problem types identified, ears compliance, and a bit on similarity analysis, which are the 4 measurements that we did look at. Let's take a bit closer look at this specific requirement itself. So this requirement says, if any component of the system fails, i.e. controller, radar, etc., then the system will disengage immediately. In this example, we have a universal quantifier of the word any, an optional open-ended clause of etc., and then a non-specific temporal word immediately. Now, the presence of these 3 problem types mean that the requirement is not clear, it's not complete, and it's not verifiable. And this is because, starting with the universal quantifier, the word any, if any component, do we really mean any? And working with the open list, with the etc., it's very unclear. Are there 3 components that we're working with? Are there 10? Are there hundreds? What could happen if I miss one? And also because all of these are put together in a singular requirement, how do we then allocate them to the teams? How do we make sure that each component is going to be able to react to this specific unwanted event? Let's say that there is a team that takes care of the controller, There's another one that takes care of the radar, and something goes wrong with the radar, like when it does fail and it's not actually disengaging within the time we've set. How do we go back and resolve that problem? Because it's now linked together with all of these other components. Also, how do you verify it? So those are some of the problems with linking all of these components together. So if we take a look at the guidance that I mentioned earlier on in this webinar, we need to restate the requirement with very specific values for any quantities mentioned and replace the open-ended clause with the information that it's being alluded to. Then there's one last problem type here, the non-specific temporal word of immediately. So what does immediately even mean? The answer is nothing. Nothing is ever immediately. It can't be tested or verified. So what we really need to do is replace this non-specific temporal word with something that is more specific and can actually be tested. So that's what I did here in the change. So instead of talking about an open-ended list of multiple components, we've honed in on one particular component, and we're talking about if the controller fails. Then the system will disengage within 0.2 milliseconds. So what I would do is I'd go back to the team. We determine that 0.2 milliseconds is an acceptable amount of time for the verification of this requirement and change that requirement. So now this requirement says if the controller fails, then the system will disengage within 0.2 milliseconds. This requirement is much more concise, and it follows all 4 of the characteristics of a good requirement. It is complete, clear, verifiable, and it is unitary as it has one and only one imperative. Next, each requirement was also analyzed at the individual level to determine the conformance to one of these 5 EARS templates. EARS, for those who don't know, stands for the Easy Approach to Requirement Syntax, and it's one of the most common writing syntax followed by requirement writing teams. It provides a framework so that authors can focus much more on the content rather than the structure of the requirement itself. And standardization of requirement syntax really helps with quicker reviews and avoiding any common pitfalls like ambiguity, being overly wordy, and lack of singularity. We have a really nice guide to EARS on our website. You can see the link at the bottom of this slide. And our previous webinar series actually did a really good deep dive into EARS, when it's used, and when you might need to think of additional best practices and strategies. For the ReqInsights project itself, the overall document EARS conformance was recorded for each document. Finally, each document was analyzed using QVScribe's similarity analysis to see whether there are any potential duplications or contradictions within the set of requirements. We determined that a requirement pair with 90 to 100% similarity are a potential duplication or contradiction. And those with 75 to about 90% similarity are highly similar, but with a lower chance of being a potential contradiction, but you still necessitate additional insight and context to determine whether this is the case. That being said, it's still super helpful to take a look at both ranges as it helps focus in from hundreds or thousands of requirements into a select few for review for potential duplications and contradictions. Especially as some organizations start to digitize their requirements in requirements management tools, we have the potential for duplications within projects. Let's say perhaps a requirement had a heading within the original document that is not present in the requirements management tool, which makes the requirement unclear and appear to be a duplication of another requirement meant to be under a different header or mode. It just leaves a lot of potential for misunderstandings within the set. Or maybe there was a change in a value or an aspect in requirement number 5 that was not reflected in a highly similar requirement, maybe 378, that is now a potential contradiction. So as a summary, the ReqInsights project performed quality analysis, similarity analysis, and an ears conformance check on nearly 13,000 requirements via QBScribe. Our team identified the top 5 problem types for 50 documents. And in today's presentation, we went over why these problem types were chosen and why they're important for understanding whether a requirement is complete, clear, unitary, and verifiable. And finally, all of these results were examined collectively to see if there's any trends and segmented by industry to see if there's any differences between the quality analysis score distribution, the top 3 problem types, ears conformance, and similarity analysis. Now, I know I just threw a lot at you, but now that you have a good understanding of the methodology behind the ReqInsights project and why these measurements were chosen and the potential impact of these findings, the next installment of the ReqInsights series will be in April 2024, where we will show an overview of the key findings of the collective results, best practices and techniques for remediating common problem types. There will be a QBScribe focus for this part, and then practical strategies to keep in mind when writing future requirements. But don't worry, I know you probably signed up for this webinar today wanting to see some results, so I'm not going to leave you today without showing you a bit of a preview of what's to come. In our findings, the top 3 problem types for the collective results were no imperatives, cross-referencing pronouns, and multiple imperatives, which means that the top 3 characteristics that caused authors a lot of trouble were making them complete, clear, and unitary, which I think is very interesting. But the question is are there still issues with verifiability among all of these requirements? Where do the other problem types fit within this distribution for all the documents? How does this impact the overall quality score? What about similarity analysis and ears conformance? Well, unfortunately, those are things you're going to have to tune into the next installment to find out. But I really appreciate you taking your time today to listen to the ReqInsights project and why our team decided to put this together. I thank you so much, and it's time for questions.
Thank you, Morgan. So we did have a couple that came through. The first one, and I apologize, I try to pronounce this word every single time, and I tend to not be successful, but it is, what is a superfluous infinitive? And can you provide an example? And they did provide an example, which was, the system shall support all future versions of Windows. Would that be a correct version?
So a superfluous infinitive is more like to be able to, is an example of that. So looking at your example, I don't see a potential superfluous infinitive there. More so, I see a universal quantifier of all. So in that context, it would be more like, do you really mean all future versions? Is that something you can test or verify in the future? But if you have other examples of that, don't hesitate to reach out to us outside of the webinar. Be more than happy to sit down with you and go through some of your requirements and see maybe how the QBScribe problem types could help you with that.
Thanks, Morgan. So the next one would be, how do you define project success in the context of ReqInsights and the analysis that you did?
Okay, it's a good question. So it's difficult. In the context of project success and in my analysis, I think if I boil it down to the simplest form, it would be achieving the good and avoiding the bad. So I think that's pretty easily understood. But what I mean by that is achieving those good characteristics of a requirement by making them complete, clear, verifiable, and unitary, based on the problem type guidance that we discussed throughout this entire presentation, and also making sure to align them with all the stakeholder needs. And then avoiding the impact of bad requirements by doing this as early on in the process as you can.
Awesome. So we've got 2 more to go.
Mhm.
How do you suggest managing conflicting requirements from different stakeholders to maintain consistency and coherence in the project goals?
That's a tough one. I know that it can be kind of difficult managing the expectations and needs of different stakeholders, but what I would suggest is to identify any potential areas of overlap or redundancy among those conflicting requirements and try to consolidate them into a cohesive and integrated set of requirements. And then taking this to your change review or whatever process you have, just to make sure everything is still aligned with your stakeholder needs.
And there was a follow-up to that one as well, and it was,
Mhm.
how can we effectively track changes to requirements throughout the project lifecycle to ensure that all stakeholders are aware of the updates and the newer versions?
That's a great question too. I know because requirements is such an iterative process. There's bound to be plenty of changes as you work through and you make sure that those stakeholder needs are met. What I would suggest is implementing a requirements management tool that has the capability of tracking any of those changes as well as version control. There's a lot of different requirement management tools out there, so I'm sure there's one that best fits your organization and your needs. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us after this webinar and talk to us directly. We can schedule some time to talk about this in more detail in relation to your specific needs, just because there's so many different ones out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. Appreciate you doing this webinar and starting the series. I know that we have the inside information at the company. We're really excited to share it with everyone. So 2 quick things. The recording will be shared with everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, probably early next week. And then the other piece is that we hope to see you in April. We'll be sending out an email to everybody that registered for this webinar once that sign up is available. And we just appreciate people joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.